Mr. Deputy Speaker of the Croatian Parliament, Mr. Dean, dear guests, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of Rector Željko Tanjic and the Catholic University of Croatia, it's my pleasure to welcome you this evening to our guest lecture. We're honored to have Professor James McAdams here with us in Zagreb on this snowy day. Professor McAdams has been a dear friend of Croatia, but also more broadly Central and Eastern Europe for many years. And we've collaborated for some time, and we're delighted to have you here in person. Professor McAdams is finishing now a book that he's been working on for some time on the history of the Communist Party in Europe. And so it's, I think, a rare treat to have him here to give us his perspective on this recent history and its significance for all of us. Jim also heads the Nanovic Institute at Notre Dame University. This institute is involved in a series of projects focusing on Europe, including an initiative involving Catholic universities throughout Central and Eastern Europe, and now expanding. So we're very grateful for your work, and we look to universities like Notre Dame for inspiration. So thank you for taking the time to come, and we're all looking forward to hearing what you have to say. So without further ado, please welcome Professor McAdams.
Thank you, Stefan. And thanks to all of you for coming out in this snow. So I've been excited to come here and to experience some serious weather since back in my town of South Bend, global warming has set in, and we are only a vacation place now. So instead of having lots of snow, we have just hot sun. I want to begin by, this is daunting. I want to begin by thanking the university and especially Rector Tanjic, Father Tanjic, for bringing me here. This is very exciting to be here. I first heard about the plans to build a Catholic University of Zagreb, of Croatia, in the early 2000s. And I've been very interested in that. It's an extremely important idea. It's extremely important for your country. It's also extremely important for the future of Catholicism, therefore for my university and for the church. And so I'm delighted to see this come to pass. It's extremely impressive. I'm going to talk a little bit tonight about one theme that comes out of a study. It comes out of a study, we'll put it this way, that has taken me prisoner for the last few years, or many years, and will keep me prisoner for some time to come, on the idea of the Communist Party, a remarkable institution, also remarkably damaging institution over nearly 2 centuries, and my book attempts to make sense of this institution from the 1840s up to the present. Tonight I will talk primarily about the recent present, at least what is the recent present for me, in that for those of us that can remember the period of 1989 and 1990, it seems like yesterday. But it wasn't yesterday, and many of you know this who are younger. So I'll begin with 2 images. The first image is of me sitting in my living room. My first job was at Princeton University, so sitting in my living room in Princeton in the fall of 1989 and turning on the evening news and seeing masses of people running around protesting in Leipzig, in East Germany, and in Berlin, in East Berlin. And my immediate response was, go back, don't do that. This is incredibly dangerous. Don't you know that you can't possibly get away with this? And since I was then writing a book in part about East Germany, I thought, and I was finishing the book, I thought, go back, because this is too complicated for my book, to have all of you out in the streets. Sometimes history isn't so cooperative. And I remember at that time in particular, I heard about one event, which was, there was a guy named Günter Schabowski, who was a longtime member of the East German Socialist Unity Party Central Committee, and who was one of the survivors after Erich Honecker, the ex-general secretary, was thrown out of office. And this man, Günter Schabowski, had profiled himself as a kind of Gorbachevian reformist. He was somebody who was going to humanize communism. And so he went out to greet these crowds of people. And he said, don't worry, comrades. We're going to fix all this. Erich Honecker, Comrade Honecker, and everybody else, they made lots of mistakes. So trust us. Everything's going to be fine. And the response of the people in the square then was to laugh. Sure, for 40 years we've experienced what you call fine, and we think we'd like something else. This is one image. Oh, and at this point, to my second image, my wife was watching this with me as I couldn't understand it. And she said, you have to go to East Berlin and you have to see this and try to make sense of it, which was incredibly generous of my wife, because usually she's not telling me to go to Germany to do my research, but she said, you have to go see it. So, second image, I went back to East Berlin, which I knew well, and I had lived in East Germany at 2 points. And so I made an appointment to see this man, Günter Schabowski, to find out what he was made of. And so I arrived, and then after a couple of days, I went over to the Central Committee headquarters, and I got to see Mr. Schabowski. And what was fascinating was he said all of these things about reform and change. He quoted Gorbachev, but he was still the same person he had always been. He was still like all of the other communist leaders of East Germany. But for 1 month, he was a kind of survivor. And so he said these nice things, and I kind of thought the whole time, I think I have heard this before for year after year after year. And so as I left his office and I was walking down the stairs out of the building, his assistant kind of grabbed me. And his assistant was maybe 50 years old, maybe 45 years old. He kind of grabbed me and he said, you know what? They don't get it. They don't understand that it's finished. And this was the chief of staff for this very important position, very important person. So who killed the Communist Party? And why should we care? Particularly if you're younger and you didn't go through this experience and you weren't writing a book about East Germany at the time. What I want to do tonight is I want to address 5 themes that will hopefully provide you with some provocative ways of thinking about the communist past and then maybe also point you a little bit to the future, as well as where we are today. I want to begin by talking about who killed communism, or rather, in my first point, who did not. Secondly, I want to talk about why the executioners of communism did what they did. Third, I want to talk about how they did what they did, which is an extremely important question. Then I want to talk about why this should matter for states that were communist but are no longer communist today. And finally, I want to conclude by thinking about how it should matter in general for all of us in dealing with non-democratic states, particularly the United States, because the United States, as a matter of history and also as a part of its role in the world, must deal with non-democratic states. We have no choice. Point one. So, who killed communism? Who killed the Communist Party? Unfortunately, it wasn't the first group. It wasn't the people who were going out in the streets and protesting against the regime. It wasn't people whom I knew, academics, who showed tremendous courage in doing this, but rather it was the Communist Party itself. The Communist Party was its own executioner in so many of these cases. But let me talk a bit about those people, because as somebody who traveled throughout this world and spent time in East Germany, I reflected a lot about what it meant for people to live under a communist regime, what it meant concretely, as opposed to just using the stereotypes that exist in the United States about what it meant. And what has stood out to me so much in writing my book and in thinking about the second part of the 20th century is not the instability of communism, but the stability of communism. The stability of the Communist Party, which may seem paradoxical, but if you think about ideologies, like Marxism, Leninism, or fascism, other ideologies, what is so profoundly interesting about the communist world is that it lasted as long as it did. That communism in the 20th century was the preeminent challenger to liberalism. And it was a great and effective challenger. It created empires, one in particular, the Soviet Union, that were in the position to destroy liberal democracy. This is remarkable that it lasted so long. I don't admire it. I didn't like it. I went through the Berlin Wall many, many, many times in my life, since the first time I went to East Germany in 1973. But what I noticed even then was that there was a kind of stupefying stability to the people's relationship with these regimes, which I think needs to be understood from the right perspective. Not that everybody was a communist, because most people weren't communists. Not that everybody woke up every morning and said, don't we love our country, and it is committed to the forces of good and revolution in the world, and we can't wait to contribute to those noble causes. Rather, people woke up in the morning and they thought about their daily lives. They thought about how they could educate their children. They thought about how they could help their friends. They thought about when they needed to go shopping, what their schedules were. And so in all of the regimes that I visited in the 1970s and 1980s, what stood out to me was the daily the daily practice of living in one of these states. I've only been to Croatia one time before, and that was a little bit before some of you were born in 1982. And at least then, I had a similar impression. Most people in their lives are not inclined to be heroes. Most people in their lives are inclined to make their way through the day. Even if they don't like their country, they will make their way through the day. And in particular, I'm talking about dictatorships here. It seems to me that in the 1970s and the 1980s, what you see so much about the relationship between the regimes and their populations was a kind of tacit agreement. A tacit agreement that, as János Kádár, the ex-general secretary of the Hungarian Communist Party, said, if you're not against us, you're with us. In other words, if you're not struggling against us all the time, if you kind of will put up with the fact that we are in control, then we won't bother you. We'll let you, or we'll take care of you, we'll provide you with a job, we'll provide you with nutrition and health care. By the way, not of very high quality. There's no reason to romanticize this period. But we'll keep you going. And if you're really good, we'll let you have a private garden on the outskirts of the city. And then you can go out to your private garden and you can say anything you want. You can do anything you want. You can talk about sports, you can criticize your leaders, whatever. But keep it to yourself privately. And among, at least in the country that I experienced the most, this was an experience that I had over and over and over again in living with regular people, ordinary people. Did they love their country? No, that was one of the problems, particularly with East Germany. They didn't love their country, but it was their home. Now, let's think about it also from the regime's perspective. There is no doubt, and this can never be emphasized enough, that from one communist country to the next, or one socialist country ruled by a communist party to the next, there can be no doubt that these regimes were in the position to use force against their populations, and lots of force, to put individuals in the position where their careers would be destroyed, where their families would be threatened, where people would be totally intimidated. But one of the challenges for all dictatorships is the use of force. You can go out and you can repress your population, but that's hard to do over and over and over again. It's hard to use force. Even if you're a psychopath and you like the idea of using force against people, like Joseph Stalin did, force can be very inefficient because it means you're concentrating on doing things that are not as important as managing the economy or acquiring nuclear weapons, threatening the United States, and so forth. Also, one of the problems that many of these regimes faced is that if you use force against people, and this is very tough for them, then people don't like you. They want to, these people in government, they wanted to be liked. They wanted to be appreciated. They wanted to be admired, like Mr. Schabowski. He clearly thought that he had a great gift to give to his population. And he wanted them to show their generosity for it. The head of the secret police, the Stasi in East Germany, gave a speech as East Germany was totally falling apart. He gave a speech in which he said to the people, "Don't you know that I love you all?" So this is a very strange way of showing love, to put people in jail and torture them. But this is a pattern that you find again and again in so many of these regimes. It's not East Germany, because East Germany is more similar to these countries than not. In between society as a whole and the regimes, you had a small group of people, some of whom I knew, who were dissidents. People like Václav Havel, for example, in Czechoslovakia, was the most famous, who had tremendous courage and who were willing to risk their careers and their opportunities to fight for what they believed in. In the case of Václav Havel, who's, as you all know, was a tremendously talented person, a great playwright, great writer. Václav Havel was willing to become a street sweeper, essentially, or a janitor, in return for speaking of the truth in these countries. But one of Václav Havel's great frustrations, and something that he wrote about, was the fact that it was so hard to get ordinary people to have the courage to speak the truth. If any of you have not read it, I strongly recommend an essay by Václav Havel called The Power of the Powerless. And he has this wonderful image in this essay, it's a long essay, of a man who is a greengrocer, who's running a little shop, who sells some vegetables, and every day this man wakes up and he puts a sign in the window. And the sign says, "Workers of the world, unite." And so Václav Havel asks to his reader, does the greengrocer have any idea what he's saying in this sign? Does he care about workers uniting, proletariat? No. But this is what he does. And Václav Havel's great problem was, how can you get him to reflect on the meaning of the sign and have that shape his actions? How do you get him to ask himself some morning, what does it mean to say, proletariat of all lands unite, in 1975, all of these years after Karl Marx was thinking about this? But that was the frustration, because the challenging of the regime that he wanted to see was not happening. One of the reasons I've come to this country is to talk with people about Croatia and to learn more, for example, about the Croatian Spring and the consequences in this country, in Croatia, about the Croatian Spring, the absolute force that the regime used in cracking down on Croatian signs of self-assertion, students' desires for greater expression. This is such a good example of those rare moments when people do speak up, and where in all of these countries the response is the use of force and violence. Second, so here's the puzzle. What I'm saying is really shocking. What I'm saying is that the Communist Party essentially committed suicide, which doesn't sound all that rational. The Communist Party was its own executioner. Well, this doesn't make sense. It seems contradictory. But I think it's the only way that you can understand what it is that drove people into the streets to protest against their regimes. And here, one of the insights that I have in writing my book, please tell me if you can't hear me if I'm moving around. I usually like to move around, so tell me if it's not working. One of the insights that I use in my book comes from the sociologist Max Weber. And Weber tries to wrestle with this question of how do you get big revolutionary change? Because in fact, revolutionary change doesn't happen that much in history. It's rare. That's why it's revolutionary change. So how do you explain it? And what Weber does is he makes an argument about unintended consequences. This is what Weber says about unintended consequences. He starts out with the premise: only people who have the power can institute fundamental change. Only people who have the power can institute fundamental change. Why? Because they have the power. Because they're in the position to decide what happens and what doesn't happen, especially in dictatorships. So the question becomes, why would these people give up their power? Why would they give up their power? That would be irrational to give up your power. And Weber's answer is, you have to assume that when people give up power, they are doing it to pursue their own interess. In other words, they're really looking at ways of increasing their power and solidifying it. They're looking at new ways of pursuing their interests, and it is all that we can rationally expect of them. Therefore, Weber argues, the only way that you can get this kind of change is if unintentionally they undermine themselves. If unintentionally, in their efforts to strengthen their positions, they make choices which inadvertently lead to their demise. And when I look back at the history of all of these different communist parties, at their evolution, what I see again and again is the way that in which their attempts to strengthen themselves somehow undercut them. What is an example of this? Well, the main example of this is Mikhail Gorbachev. And we're now in a position where, as historians, we're looking more and more closely at Gorbachev and trying to decide what kind of credit we should give him for historical change. I think there's no question Mikhail Gorbachev set in motion events that were truly revolutionary. I don't think you can dispute this at all. But as an historian, I come down on the side of those who say, Mikhail Gorbachev didn't intend to be a revolutionary. Mikhail Gorbachev was a good socialist, was a Marxist-Leninist. And what Mikhail Gorbachev was trying to do was to figure out ways of cementing his authority, of rebuilding the image of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union, of giving it more credibility. And he introduced a series of reforms, which all of you have heard about, political, economic, social, a series of reforms which slowly undermined his own authority. In part because when we look back at this period in the 1980s, he and other reformers at this time underestimated the growing complexity of communism and of these states. They underestimated what they were dealing with. They thought that they could push one part of society, for example, the economy. They would get major changes. They would look good. People would like them again. They wouldn't have to use the police, and everything would be great. What they didn't recognize, though, was that communism had become more and more complicated, more and more fragile, so that if you introduce changes in one area, such as the economy, then you had to deal with questions that you were less familiar with. For example, questions involving information technology. You can't run an economy effectively unless you can pass information through a society so that you know what the supply and demand is for what you're trying to produce, so that you can give the right kinds of information to managers, and so forth. These problems had always been there in the past. And from country to country, including the former Yugoslavia, the Soviet Union, East Germany. As they approached them, they would kind of go like this, and they'd try this and that and so forth, and they'd come to a point and they'd say, no, we're going to stop there because that's very bad. What Gorbachev tried to do is he tried to push these issues. And he pushed them more and more under international pressure. And I think also in the desire to improve his own image as the savior of the Soviet Union and as the savior of communism. And what he found was that once he introduced some political reforms, he had to deal with some economic reforms, then he had to deal with some questions of Soviet security and so forth. So if you go back, as I have done, and you look at this period, what you see is a kind of tumbling into unintended consequences. You see somebody who is charismatic, who's very smart, who's ambitious. You see him falling into this change, that change, so forth, thinking about the role of the Communist Party and wanting it to redefine it in a way that would help him. And as we all know, ultimately not helping him. But staying on the same point, I've mentioned the executioners. Gorbachev was a big executioner. He was the big wazoo in some ways. But what I think is more important was the effect of these changes on the people right below him, on average Communist Party members, people who were members of the Central Committee, people who had given their lives to this cause, who were then inclined to ask themselves, what is it we're doing anyway? At one time, communism had seemed so natural. It had seemed, like a great ideal you could struggle for. Gorbachev comes into office and talks about all the economic problems. He raises all these dreams of democratization. And then they look around themselves, and not just in the Soviet Union, but in East Germany, in Romania, in Hungary, and elsewhere. And they ask themselves, how good is this after all? What have we invested our lives in? And more these people become skeptical. And I should say, not just in the Communist Party, but even in organizations like the secret services, like the secret police. The educated people start to ask themselves, why should we care? This is something that I experienced again and again when I talked with these people who were in the position to help an American conduct social science research in differing countries. And what I also found was they were not just frustrated about or confused about this process they were involved in, but that in Eastern Europe, most of them looked at their governments, and their governments opposed Gorbachev. And they thought, what is this about? How is it possible that they could oppose Gorbachev? Didn't we grow up learning that to follow the Soviet Union is to be victorious? And now you're telling us, well, this time we won't follow the Soviet Union? Isn't that insane? Isn't the Soviet Union the center of world communism? This was not taking place in Yugoslavia because, of course, you had different ideas about the Soviet Union. But my impressions are that these questions were still being raised among communist elites in this country or in the ex-Yugoslavia. I'll add here, when I think about Yugoslavia, based on what I read, but also in conversations with you, it seems to me that Broz Tito experienced his own unintended consequences. That Broz Tito was always looking for a formula to hold Yugoslavia together. In some ways, I think, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that his formula contributed to the fall of the Communist Party in this country. In part, and again you can correct me if I'm wrong, in part because in Yugoslavia, you ended up not just with one Communist Party, but after a while, you ended up with many Communist parties, because each of the republics developed stronger Communist parties, like here, and then started to ask themselves, why should we obey the Communist Party in Belgrade when we know what's good for Croatia? You go back and you look at Tito. Tito's formula was to hold Yugoslavia together. Well, he didn't do a very good job. And thank goodness for that. I mean, really, thank goodness for that. But there is an irony here. Point 3. So what I'm saying to you is that communists started to get involved in this, and they started to reject what they had believed in, or at least what they found somehow kind of worked for different reasons. They were part of the system, it was their job, they had a little bit of idealism, a lot of cynicism, but it was still kind of what they did. They killed communism in 2 ways. One which I experienced directly, which is of incalculable importance, which I tell my students is they went on vacation. Literally, in the summer, late summer of 1989, when I was in East Germany, I went to see some friends of mine and just some people I generally know who were very loyal to this government. And that was the time when people had started to leave East Germany en masse, and the chaos was just beginning there. And in the past, my friends and acquaintances would have been very indignant, and they would have struggled against this. And literally, in this one occasion, they said, do you want to go out to our tent place, you know, by this lake and just relax? And I thought, your country's falling apart and you're working for the Central Committee or the Party Academy and you just want to go on vacation? Well, that was their response. But it was so in an even more serious respect. To get back to the issue of force. In the past, in East Germany and Czechoslovakia, Poland, and this country, or Yugoslavia, in the past, the regime would have responded with force. The difference in all of these countries is that when they were called to use force, they decided not to. And Gorbachev is the perfect example of this. When Gorbachev was asked to defend the whole East European communist bloc, not counting Yugoslavia, in as late as 1989, the spring of 1989, he and his foreign minister and others, they said, you know, we don't have time to get involved with the future of communism in that part of the world. We're concentrating on the Soviet Union. Don't ask us to use our troops to come in and help you restore your countries. In fact, there was a period, I remember, when the Soviet foreign minister gave a speech in Paris and somebody asked him, are you ready to defend the Berlin Wall and use Soviet troops to defend the Berlin Wall if necessary? And this guy, Shevardnadze, responded, well, that's not our wall. We didn't build that wall. The East Germans built the wall. Ask them if they're going to defend the wall. And the East Germans, I found this when I went over the foreign ministry, the East Germans were like, my God, they're saying that we built the wall, they built the wall. When we built the wall, we assumed that they would come to defend us. Now they're not going to defend us. What's the matter with this? Nobody wanted to use the force anymore. Sure, some. There were some generals in the Soviet Union that thought that they should bring troops into Eastern Europe. but they weren't in the majority. And maybe it's to Gorbachev's credit that he did not support them. I will give Gorbachev credit for that. So this is one reason the communists went on vacation. The other reason, though, is that they adopted new identities. And one of the most important questions to ask about this period is, how did people go from one identity to adopting another identity? How did people become Democrats overnight? How did this happen? We see it particularly in the theme of democratic change. It's amazing when you look back at this period that most of the communist regimes of Eastern Europe fell without violence. And I think that's in part because there were members of the regime who were willing to change. A good example here that I write about is Hungary. In the spring of 1989, there was a meeting off in the countryside in a little house to talk about the future of Hungary, and it was attended by anti-communists, people who were huge critics of the regime, and also by members of the Central Committee. And they didn't put it this way, but this is what happened. They got together in the countryside and drank some good Hungarian wine and felt good about themselves and had a discussion about how to just get rid of this whole period, how to just get rid of communism. And the amazing thing is, they did it. They undermined their own regime enough that it became more and more difficult for the communists to assert themselves or for the communist regime to assert itself. They became something else. Did they really become something else? No, people don't change their identities like that. If I look at myself, there are many things that for 50 years now I've been trying to change, they just won't go away. They're still there, and so I'm stuck with them. But they changed in that way. Or they became fans of Mikhail Gorbachev. I remember I had a meeting, a very unusual meeting early on with a guy who had been a head of the East German intelligence service. I still don't know why this happened, a guy named Marcus Wolf, who was supposed to be the super spy. And when I met him, and this was considerably for the fall of communism, suddenly this man who had been involved in indirectly killing people and jailing people in the 1950s was a pussycat. He was just an incredibly charming, well-spoken individual who supported Gorbachev. And I still think he was a very charming guy, but I also know about his past. Speaking about the secret police, one of the still unexplained transition is what happened in Romania when the communist regime fell in a very short period of time, and Nicolae Ceausescu and his wife were trotted out someplace in the countryside and shot. That all seems very heroic, but it turns out when we look at it carefully, it looks like something that was engineered by the secret police in Romania. Nobody's ever totally proven that, but it looks like something that couldn't have been accidental and wasn't simply, a demonstration of humanity. The other way, though, in which people adopt new identities, which is a question that I have in thinking about the ex-Yugoslavia, is they adopt more dangerous identities, one of which is nationalism. When I think about the roots of the fall of Yugoslavia, I can't help but immediately think about Slobodan Milosevic and the way in which overnight he went from being Communist Party apparatchik, unthinking, authoritarian, mean-spirited fellow into becoming a mean-spirited nationalist and propagator of Serbian chauvinism. And so, in a way, when we look back at this period, I think that the other countries in Eastern Europe are luckier that their transition was as peaceful as it was. Again, though, when we look at them, we say, one of the most important things was that the people who could use force didn't use force. They could have done it. When Gorbachev came to power, or even several years after Gorbachev came to power, they could have used force, and they probably would have. Imagine what would have happened in Europe if people had decided to fight back against these masses of demonstrators in the streets. This was what I was asking myself in Princeton in October of 1989. What would have happened if the police had come out? What would Europe have looked like? It would not have been a happy situation. I always tell my students I pause for a second. After I've talked for a while, I pause so that I can kind of like order my own thoughts and make sure that I continue to be clear. So why does this matter for former communist states? One of the most fascinating aspects of my visit to Zagreb is hearing how this issue is so current in people's thinking in this country. Of all of the formerly communist states that I have visited, which is most of them, this is the country in which I hear this discussion come up most, which is fascinating. Well, in part because people experience this. You know, if there were justice in the world, the people that really should have been rewarded throughout Eastern Europe were these dissidents, people like Václav Havel, people who really sacrificed a lot, who were courageous. But from country to country to country, the result has been that they have no role. Sure, Václav Havel became president, but he never had much ability to control events around him. History was not on their side. Some people with whom I've spoken here have suggested that history was on the side of many communists. And maybe you will agree. Certainly in all of the East European states, what we see from Poland to Hungary to Romania and elsewhere is a pattern in which the people who were in power, the people who were well-placed in these regimes, also people in the security police, were able to have privileged positions with respect to the remnants of the economy. We see in many cases that privatization made some private people amazingly wealthy, in part because they could control information. They knew about how to gain access to goods, and they promptly acquired them. This is one sense in which you can't really speak about justice. There was an injustice to the transition. Politically, I think this is true to differing degrees from country to country. But there's certainly a way in which the transition from a communist state to a non-communist one had to involve the maintenance of certain, personnel in almost every significant bureaucratic position. If you think about what communism was in all of these countries, the revolution against it took off the very top in most cases, not all cases, but in many cases it simply took off the very top elite. But for practical reasons, you still had an organization that had been involved in the control of every aspect of the economy and every aspect of society, and for good or bad was there. So we should care about that, and particularly if those people continue to control wealth and control political positions in all of these countries, we should care about what that means for democracy. Finally, we should care about the fact that it means something for ideas, which is part of what this university is about. I think one of the most important aspects of the transition was the ways in which, in all of these regimes, ideas about what counted in terms of people's values, in terms of the sacrifices they would make, in terms of their attitudes about modernity, all of the ideas of decades of socialism were quite naturally passed on. In some ways, I think socialism or Marxism, Leninism was a form of radical secularization, such that it was, in the communist period, impossible for religious institutions to defend their ideas, not just to defend their institutions, but to defend their ideas. In every case in Eastern Europe, save for Poland, which is always a special case. So it turns out that the issue of ideas, so many years after this period, for decades after this period, is still pregnant. It's still there. And what I find in traveling around to all of these different Catholic universities is how important it is that they be in a position to present people, younger people, with alternative views of looking at the world, with alternatives to the kind of radical secularism that was introduced under Marxism, Leninism. And I would also say alternatives to the secularism that you find in Western Europe. I'm a very serious believer in Catholic higher education, and for me, this is a huge challenge. Finally, why should we care? We should also care because these questions affect the way that we deal with dictatorships. In the best of all possible worlds, you shouldn't have to deal with dictatorships. You should just be able to say, well, you know, I have pure values, and so I'm not going to deal with those people. Like the United States in dealing with the Saudis, the Saudi Arabia, you know, there are many problems with Saudi Arabia. But you can't be a purist if you're working in the Middle East. In the case of communist transitions, this question is still there, just as much as it was there in the past for countries in Eastern Europe. Right now, the United States is facing a major challenge in a transition that is finally coming to Cuba. For decades, I have been predicting to my students the death of Fidel Castro. And for some reason, Fidel Castro continues to live on and on. You know, I tell them, sometime during this class, he's going to die and we can study that. And he doesn't take my class, so he doesn't know that he has this heroic service to prepare. But let's face it, Fidel Castro will die, but he's also gone in that he's passed the leadership of the country on to his brother, to Raul Castro. The problem that the United States faces, well, will face in a big way, is that we will have to ask ourselves, who will we deal with when the transition comes to Cuba? Because the challenge will come to communism. In part because Cuba is no longer a communist country. I don't care what anybody says. I've been to Cuba. True, they destroyed the economy. When you go there, it looks like going to East Germany. It's awful. But Cuba is essentially a military dictatorship right now. A transition is coming, and the problem the United States has is that it has taken itself out of the picture. The United States can't find these people who are dissatisfied with communism, who are in the government. We can't find them because for decades we have refused to have any ties at all with Cuba. And you can say to yourself, that's a good principled stand that we have no ties with Cuba because it's a terrible dictatorship. I agree. I've been there. It's a terrible dictatorship. But if you have no ties with somebody, you cannot influence them. How do you influence them? Who are they? Who do you talk with? And so a major question that will arise in at least the next couple of years will be, who is it that we're going to deal with? Particularly, who is it that we're going to deal with in the military? And we have no easy answer to this question. But we are in the position where we have to recognize that you have to deal with somebody. If you don't deal with people who are in power, then you might put yourself in the position that you don't have anybody to talk to, or maybe you talk to the wrong people. So you need to ask yourself the tough question of how you deal with political change, how you deal with the unanticipated consequences of people's decisions. And one thing I'll add about Cuba, because I've been thinking a lot about it recently, suddenly Americans can go to Cuba. So something is in the works in this country that has the last claim to be a communist state, even though it's not. The same questions will arise with China. Who do we deal with in the case of China? China's not really a communist country anymore. But we will still need to be wrestling with the question of who are the people that can affect change? Who are the people who, even if we don't like them, might be in the position to change a country in a direction that might be somewhat appealing to us, or not as bad as other alternatives? And as I think about these questions as an historian, I look forward to coming up with ideas that will point us in the right direction. So thank you very much, and I certainly welcome your questions, because I may have said things you disagree with.
So we'll open the floor for questions. Jim has given us a lot to think about. If I could abuse my role as moderator, I have a question about the role of John Paul II in this whole dynamic, and how you see his election as Pope, in particular his first visit to Poland in 1979, what effect that had on people's attitudes, and perhaps encouraging more open defiance of the communists.
Well, I think that, I'm a great admirer of John Paul II. I think that he demystified communism in a way that the Polish communists could not respond to. It's impossible to understand the Solidarity trade union movement without referring to John Paul II. He was clearly the key figure. One question that remains unresolved, though, is how important he was to the other developments in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. One thing I've found is that when you go back and you read the discussions that Gorbachev and other Soviet leaders had about what they should do in their country, or about developments in other countries, they don't talk very much about Poland. In part because people always look at Poland as a special case. And it is, in many, many respects, a special case. I would be a little bit more cautious, and I would say that John Paul II did have this lasting demystifying effect, and he was a true hero. But so far, I haven't found the evidence that suggests that he had quite the effect that some people would claim he did. But the imposition of martial law in Poland did have a huge effect, because the imposition of martial law raised the question of, do we use force or not? And there were two parties involved here. One was the Soviet Union, and one was the Polish regime. The Soviet Union had to ask itself, do we want to use force to hold all of this together? And they had a serious discussion, debate, fights about it, and they ultimately decided, no. It's no longer worth bringing Soviet troops in. So they told the Poles, you resolve the question yourself. And the Poles looked at them like, well, we don't want to do it because if we use our military, then we'll have a civil war. The Soviets said, well, it's your problem. And anyway, we're the Soviet Union, we're telling you use your own army. And they did. But from this point onward, if you were a mid-level, well-educated, foreign-traveled member of the Communist Party in any of these countries, you had to ask yourself, what would I do in this circumstance? And many did not want to use force, particularly after Gorbachev. It wasn't worth it.
So, questions, please. Floor is open.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you very much for your fascinating analysis of these two questions you posed and the answers you offered to us. I would like to share a brief anecdote and pose a question after that. A few years ago, while I was working at the Croatian mission to NATO, I talked to my ambassador when he came back from reception with the Secretary General of NATO, and asking, well, how it was. And he was telling me it was great, and at some point in time, it was an interesting moment where I was with the Slovenian colleague, and then also some other ambassadors from the former Yugoslavia. They're not still members, but they want to be, and they join us. So we were all ambassadors for former Yugoslav republics. And at some point in time, we recognized that we were all former members of the Communist Party.
Mm-hmm.
So, and now at a NATO reception with the Secretary General, and two countries being the NATO members. Question actually is whether you would consider that in this particular case of the former Yugoslavia, actually, is there any life, political life, outside the former Communist Party in terms of...
You mean now?
Yes. In terms of leadership, in terms of people who could join the political elite, not just from a marginal, but the center of the political, economic elite, actually an elite in a broader sense, because we also, the media elite, the academic elite, whatever you want, they're still mostly recruiting from this 5% of people who were members of the Communist Party. They're not necessarily communists. So
right.
Most of them would not define themselves as such today. But they do care who was and who wasn't.
Yes.
It seems to be a criteria for...
Oh, you mean if you were a communist, then you have a special benefit?
It's a little bit easier, I would say.
Huh, interesting.
Is that something you also noted in your analysis? Is something you paid attention to? Or is this, just to finish my question, is this probably one of the aspects why one of the most progressive, let's say, socialist regimes in the past, as Yugoslavia in comparison to the Soviet Union, actually is doing so badly in political and economic reforms today, in comparison with other Central European countries?
Yes, obviously everybody in this room has more expertise than I do to talk about the ex-Yugoslavia. But I'll start off saying that the issue is so much stronger here than it is in any other formerly communist country that I visited, and so much more deeply felt. The first thing is, I don't want to say that everybody that was a member of the League of Communists of Yugoslavia was a bad person, because most educated people, I suppose, who are teaching at universities or whatever, were members of the League of Communists. Otherwise, it would be hard to do what you wanted to do. So if somebody's a physicist and they're a member of the League of Communists, then, you know, that's normal. I guess that the question is, again, based upon the information that you're providing me, is whether, first of all, these should be the only people, former communists, and then secondly, what kind of communists? So my answer would be, well, they shouldn't be the only people because obviously you have a new generation. I mean, the hope for all of these countries is you have a new generation that won't have these past experiences and that will, you know, come and be good economists and managers and, you know, experts in international finance and do the right things for the country. The other question, though, is which people do you want in power? And this is the question of lustration that you're interested in, that I think this country has faced less than other countries. I have written about lustration in East Germany and also in other new democracies, other former dictatorships. And I think it's very important that you ask who is most suited for holding a public position. And you ask that on an individual basis. You don't, I think it's a mistake if you just say, well, so-and-so belong to this movement and therefore they're not suitable. But in East Germany, they had in Germany, they had a very involved process of asking questions about who did what. Should you have a school principal who used to do terrible things to her teachers? Should you have that person continue to be a school principal? Or should you have your police force run by the same people that ran the police force in the German Democratic Republic? And so personally, I think that's important to do. Now, my final point, though, is I think what this country needs, and I'm only speaking about this part of the world as an American, I think what this country and other parts of East Central Europe need are people, wherever they come from, who are idealists. One of the universities I admire most and the group that we work with is the Catholic University of Ukraine. Ukraine is completely corrupt. I can't tell you whether there's corruption in this country, but no country that I know of can compete with Ukraine. Not even Russia can compete with Ukraine. And what the Catholic University does there is it deliberately tries to provide an image of a better way of acting to its students. An image of what it means to lead an honorable life, what it means to be a Catholic Christian. You know, for me, it's people like that you need to find and cultivate, or for whom you need to create the right situation so that you can cultivate them. I think if societies don't do that, then they won't have much hope. And it's important in this part of the world, but it's also important in West Europe, would be the other thing I add. When I'm in Western Europe, I don't feel a sense of great idealism. I don't feel the nobility of purpose. I find a kind of bland, consumer-oriented world in which people don't think about the kinds of values that would be important for Catholic higher education. They need more Catholic universities, but they've done away with that. You have to look hard.
Next question.
Maybe just one reflection
Yes.
to what you said about the situation in this country and some other countries, where you mentioned that quite a number of people had fine university careers, and that it's okay if they were members of the party, because that obviously was a sort of way how to manage your way easier and so on. But we have to say that we all had the choice.
Mm-hmm.
We all had the choice. And so some of us decided not to join, and maybe to go a little bit longer way, and maybe more hard way, but you could achieve everything.
Yes.
At least in academia, you could become. You maybe would not be a rector of the university, but you could be a professor and head of department and everything. So it was a choice. And those people deliberately made that choice. So we should not somehow exculpate them.
Yes. I admire your position. I hope I'm not interrupting, but I admire your position so much. And in my own case, in thinking about the countries that I used to deal with, and particularly East Germany, I think it's very important to identify people who cared enough to preserve their integrity. And so when I go back to East Germany now, and I deal with people that I knew before, and everybody that I dealt with before, every single person was writing reports on me. Every single person. It was required. You could get in trouble if you didn't. And so the question that I have posed about my own personal relationships is what was the motivation of this person? Because when people say about many of these countries, oh, everybody had to report to the secret police, or everybody had to deal with the secret police, for example. I'm using extreme cases. It's not true. You did have to write these reports, but you didn't have to accept money for these reports. The difference, I think, with Yugoslavia is that in most of the East European countries of the Soviet bloc, you couldn't become a professor. Not in philosophy, not in modern history, if you weren't a member of the party. It just didn't happen.
In mass media,
you could in mass media?
You couldn't. In
yeah.
Psychology, that's my faculty, you couldn't.
Yeah. So it's, you know, so what did people do? Well, the people that I liked became medieval historians. You know, so all you needed to do was to say, Karl Marx says that, you know, about this, about feudalism, and then you could do very good medieval scholarship. But so I always ask myself, what choices could people make? And personally, I admire people the most who stood up for their integrity. It's great human value. And, you know, I'm reluctant to comment about Croatia, but sometimes when you, so I'll do this obliquely, but sometimes when you look at politicians, you ask yourself, why is this person doing what they're doing? Does this person have great ideals, whatever they are, or are they merely opportunists? Communism was excellent at successfully cultivating opportunists. It had one of the only successful industries in these countries was cultivating opportunism. That and the secret police, those were major successful industries. And, you know, no democracy, as you know better than I, no democracy can succeed if it's only based on opportunism.
Yes. Well, actually, just a short introduction for people who don't know me. My name is Vanja Ivan Savic. I'm from law school from University of Zagreb. I'm senior lecturer there. Also, I'm a member of a fraternal council of the Croatian Catholic community, ME. Well, I'm interested in the intersection between law, religion, and politics, and I have just one really, I hope, short question for Professor. I'm interested, did the surveys around Eastern Bloc, in how many, to which extent in particular countries, Catholic Church or other religious institutions actually had impact on killing the communism in particular countries? Well, actually, I have a short, I will just read because this is much better than I'm saying. from my head. Probably you're familiar with the book of Jason Wittenberg, who wrote about the situation in Hungary. And he wrote interesting that it demonstrates how, despite the many deviations of communism, the Roman Catholic and Calvinist churches transmitted loyalties to parties of the right. Contrary to conventional wisdom, church resistance occurred not from far from above, but from below, and hemmed and harassed by Communist Party members, parish priests and pastors employed a variety of ingenious tactics to ensure the continued survival of local church institutions. These institutions insulated their adherents from pressures to assimilate into the surrounding socialist milieu. Ultimately, this led to political continuity between pre- and post-communism. So I'm just wondering what's your perspective on this issue?
Yeah, I know Jason Wittenberg, so I should try to be very generous to him. Well, first of all, in terms of challenging communism, the hero is the Catholic Church, because the Catholic Church has always been a church militant. It's not like the Orthodox Church that strikes deals as easily. But even if it's a heroic church, I think that we need to be careful at how much effect we attribute to it, in saying how much the church could actually destabilize these regimes. One major reason for this is the Catholic Church was persecuted. Hungary is Jason has a wonderful case here, because in Hungary, the relationship between regime and society was, fairly differentiated. But if you're a member of the Catholic Church in Ukraine, for example, to meet this priest who was going to give you ideas, the priest would have to be extremely courageous. He would have to come to your house, everybody by special arrangement. None of the neighbors could know. All of the blinds would have to be pulled down, and then you could have Mass. So one has to be realistic about what the Catholic Church could do. So I would say the role is more heroic than it was demonstrably a matter of cause and effect, except for Poland. I mean, Poland, for an American, when I started going to Poland regularly in the 1990s, I was just shocked. Look at the Catholic Church in Poland. Everybody's Catholic. And there are religious vocations and wonderful seminaries, and our partner is the Catholic University of Lublin. Everybody's Catholic. Well, this is kind of the nature, or they were. This is kind of the nature of Poland. But it hasn't been the nature of most of these states. So I will ask Jason about his argument. It probably works extremely well for Hungary, but this is always the problem with scientific experimentation: is you need more cases.
Sure. Thanks. One final question.
Professor, I like very much your analysis about the Communist Party which committed suicide. 20 years later, we can witness here, we can see in other ex-communist countries that this network of communist power and this mental substance of communism is still alive and is quite strong. So my question is about current Western leaders and the policies of leading Western countries like United States, like the European countries. 20 years ago, they were very much against communism, and everybody was applauding when the communism break down. So I'm interested how much they care today about the consequences of this suicide of Communist Party, Are they aware of that? And do they find that is a problem, that that the substance of communism is still quite alive in some countries?
In the best of all possible worlds, they would care very much, but I think it comes down to priorities and what you need to attend to now. And here I would differentiate between two sets of countries. One is Western European countries in the EU. Another is the United States. I don't have high expectations of the United States because the United States is involved in so many things. I've been coming to Europe since 1973, and what I've found is that Europeans, so not Croatians, but other Europeans, will always have two views about the United States. One is, damn it, you shouldn't have done that. And the other is, damn it, you should have done that. And so what happens is, as an American, I feel like, so we're supposed to save the world, and at the same time, we're not supposed to save the world. We're supposed to get involved in everything. So that's kind of my answer there. I think that a great power, like the United States, which doesn't always enjoy being a great power, needs to be very selective. And it can do that. I think that a country like the United States needs to ask itself questions about its relationship with Mr. Putin, for example. Who is this man, after all, who used to be a colonel in the KGB? And what message should we give him? I don't believe there's an easy answer to that, but that's an example of where we should be involved. The other parties are particularly the founders of the European Union. As an American, I always feel like the European Union needs to do more. European Union is always, well, the member states of the European present themselves as noble, having the highest ideals, the French in particular, and it can be very critical of the United States. I think they should be more directly involved in the affairs or the well-being of other countries. One can look back at the policies of Western European states towards Yugoslavia, and one might come to the conclusion that they should have done more. But again, getting back to the best of all possible worlds, it's important to get involved in specific issues. It's also important to be responsible for the consequences of your involvement and to know what you're doing. And the issue of who is running the government in Croatia will not be one of the main priorities. For that reason. Hopefully the priority of our ambassador and some smart people around the ambassador.
So thank you very much, Jim.
So, Jim, thank you for coming. Please take the seat. I just want to briefly thank you for coming to our university. It was a great opportunity having you here, to talk to you, and having experience to hear about your work and everything you have done. So we are hoping also to be a valuable member of this Nanovic Institute. I would say already family of Catholic universities around the world, especially in Eastern Europe. And we have a small gift for you. That's just briefly what I wanted to say after all of that. There are two things now is wrapped up. But one is the book about Cardinal Stepinac in Hrvatsko. You can meet a little bit the figure of Cardinal Stepinac, who is very important for us, and who is also, I would say, protector of our university, and who is giving also his spirit and his strength to us to fulfill, I would say, all goals that we have toward the future of the church, but our society and our students in Croatia. And secondly, you know what? This is a small stone, a real stone, taken from the cathedral in Zagreb.
Really?
Yeah, during the restoration, you see, and this is also, here is a small figure of Madonna, mother of Kamenitara on stone, how to say, stone gates. That is wonderful. So that you can remember you.
I am so pleased to have that. That is so wonderful. And I will ask you to say a blessing over it later.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you very much.
But I invite you to take a glass of wine downstairs and to stay around together talking to you in another half hour. If you have time, okay? First floor.